Hey guys, Paul here with another vlog update here with Late Night Games. It is Monday, day 8, the beginning of week 2. Today, what I wanted to talk to you guys about is something that's been near and dear to my heart for quite some time. And that is the Final Fantasy franchise. And what I would like to call the rise and fall of Final Fantasy. Now, just a quick disclaimer. I have not beaten every single Final Fantasy game. Some of those are just impossibly long, and I am only a mortal man. Well, immortal till proven otherwise, but that's another story. And while some of the newer games aren't that bad of games as a standalone, calling them Final Fantasy is what really gripes at me. So once upon a time, in the land of Hyrule, there was a little boy... Wait, wrong game series. Once upon a time, there was a group of 4 heroes. And they went on this amazing adventure, which involved pirates, and fortune tellers, and fighting people, and time travel, and imps, and dungeons, and it was awesome. The first Final Fantasy game hit the world by storm, but was underappreciated at its time, in my opinion. Not as many people knew what it was until after it'd been around for a while. But I guess it's that way with any of the old franchises. Some of the first games weren't necessarily looked at as well until they went back and looked at them. And Final Fantasy had a great mechanic for a role-playing game. It was the standard of the JRPG genre. And as time went on, this grew and adapted. They put in jobs, they put in roles, they put in limit breaks. Every game came out with something a little new, a little fresh, but it still maintained that original core concept of the character classes: the white mage, the black mage, the red mage, the blue mage, the fighter, the lancers, the dragoons. These weren't characters in every game, but these characters did make continual appearances. And then, of course, you got the chocobos, and chocobos are just adorable. Now, my first introduction to the Final Fantasy genre, I must admit, was Final Fantasy VII. It was the first Final Fantasy game I played. It was on PlayStation 1, and it was great. Yes, Cloud was kind of a whiny McEmo pants. It was for character development, guys. Yeah, character development aside, he was kind of a manic-depressive kid, and so was Sephiroth, and the characters themselves, while being very cliche now, at the time were something amazing and new. The game's graphics were stunning, the gameplay was spot on, the battle mechanics were awesome, the limit breaks and the summons, oh my god, the summons. But Final Fantasy VII isn't where the Final Fantasy story began. You've got 6 other games, or 3 in North America, because 3 is 6 and 2... They're really confusing as to what ones are what between the Japanese release and the North America release. I still haven't gotten my head around it. But that all being said, Final Fantasy continued to hold to be a great game. Final Fantasy VIII was a step down from 7 mechanics-wise. Graphics went up a bit. They introduced some card game that I thought was just dumb, but you know what? A lot of people like the card game. But it still had a good, solid level-up system, a solid gameplay, and a solid story. Final Fantasy IX was also a really good one. The first one where I'm starting to see Final Fantasy start to fall off was Final Fantasy X-2. Final Fantasy decided to do something with X-2 that it had never done before, and this set the precedent for some horrible games to come. They implemented a sequel of one of their games. Now, I'm not talking about sequels in the way of Final Fantasy Chronicles, Final Fantasy Dungeon, Chocobo Dungeon, or Final Fantasy Tactics, which then had Tactics Advance and Tactics 2. These weren't sequels of the original. These were no different than Final Fantasy 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. But Final Fantasy X-2 was a direct sequel off of the story of Final Fantasy X. Which the story of Final Fantasy X had an end that, while not everyone was the happiest with it, it was a satisfying end. It was a full end. It was a complete end, and they could have left it at that, and everyone would have been happy. But come on, Paul, you gotta admit, those little ladies were damn there pretty in their transformations in 10-2. Yes, the transformation sequences and all the different outfits for the 3 main girls of 10-2 was great, and I did like the character of Pain, and Riku was also awesome, and Yuna even became more tolerable in this game than she was in 10. The problem was the story. He had never existed in their world, but then they wanted to find him after No. And the whole game is searching for Titus, and Titus, whatever you want to pronounce it as. However, unless you get 100%, you get to the end and there's no Titus. You never found him. So, unless you 100% the game to get the good ending, the entire game was a pointless journey of fan service and flashy clothing for girls. Which I'm sure a lot of the guys appreciated, but it wasn't as good of a game as 10, and I felt it took away from 10. Now, that's just my opinion. Everyone has their own, and you're welcome to your own. I'd like to hear yours down in the comment section, but anyways, moving on, we had Final Fantasy XI. Now, Final Fantasy XI was the first Final Fantasy game to be online. It was an MMORPG. And it was a damn fun MMORPG. I will give it that. But Final Fantasies are not MMOs. Now, this could be the final of the Final Fantasies because it never ends. MMOs go on forever. Except this one didn't. It eventually reached the end of the story, and they're now working on Final Fantasy XIV, unless that's already out. I'm not 100% sure. Once Final Fantasy got into the double digits, I started to get saddened more and more each time. Now, Final Fantasy XII had the same gameplay feel as Final Fantasy XI. It felt like you were running around in an MMO. But it was a single-player game, and it was well done. The story was decent. It wasn't my favorite story by far, but it started to feel like Final Fantasy used to feel again. It wasn't slam-wham thrown together. It was well developed. And I felt there was hope for Final Fantasy once again. That 10-2 was just a sad remnant of our past. We could all move past it. Move past the fact that fans needed fan service, so the producers gave them what they wanted. And continue on with a glorious Final Fantasy world. Then came the first Final Fantasy game I ever pre-ordered. A game that promised to be amazing, promised to be beautiful, on the newest next-gen systems. It was out for 360, PS3. This was promising to be a great, wonderful game. It was the first cross-platform Final Fantasy game, with the exception of the online being on PS2 and PC. But, either way, this game was going to be awesome. I plugged it in, and the intro, okay, kind of linear, no worries. Go a little further in the game, okay, it has to choose my party members for me. Sure, whatever, it's still the beginning of the game. An hour into it, wow, they're still not letting me choose my own party members. They never let you choose your own party members during the first, half of the game. I, like many other people, dubbed this game Final Hallway 13. As the entire game was so linear that there was no exploration, there was no wandering off. The game was 13 chapters long, hence the 13. The 13 theme was used a lot in the game. And until chapter 11, that's right, chapter 11. If you go through numbers 1 through 13, 11 does not come very early on. Until chapter 11, there was no real free roaming. And then chapter 11 was a big open field you could free roam with monsters and stuff that's on the new planet you've arrived on. And yay, free roaming! Finally, enjoy! For one chapter. And that's it. That's all the free roaming explanation you got. Sorry, exploration. There was no hunting down chocobos and breeding them to get the best ride possible to get across. There was no getting the airship and finding the airship pilot and flying around the world, backtracking to explore the places you once were not strong enough to go and had to pass by. The game was so linear and so progressively driven that it was just, there was none of that go out and see the world element. It became a game that played itself. Not only was the game very linear, but the combat system was automatic. You pre-programmed what you wanted your characters to do in combat. Now, you could stop and reprogram them midway through battle, but for the most part, battle was automatic. As a test, I had my party running around in circles in the big open field, just got my controller jammed in there, and then hit the auto button, and the battle finished itself. I had to maybe press a button every 5 minutes to play this game. This is not a game. This is a cinematic that you're watching and interacting with a little bit. The game was like a giant freaking QuickTime event. There wasn't any game to it. But come on, guys, that's the way games are now. That's how people want things to be. No one ain't got time for that shiznit to actually have to play the game. They just want to see what happens. If you're going to use the argument that we want to see what happens, at least give us some likable characters. And then, just when we thought Square Enix had driven the final stake into the heart of the Final Fantasy universe and left it dead on the corner, it came over and it put a little Dirty Sanchez on its lip as it released a sequel to Final Hallway 13. Not only that, but from what I've been reading, there is a third sequel coming out, thus making Final Hallway 13 a trilogy. Now, I'll be honest here. I haven't gotten around to playing Final Fantasy 13-2 or Final Fantasy 13-3 because, well, 13-3 isn't out yet. And after the horrible, horrible experience it was getting through 13, I had no interest on ever revisiting these characters ever again. I went from a fan that loved Final Fantasy and loved the characters and found very little I could nitpick to someone who couldn't be bothered to buy it from a bargain bin for $10 this weekend that I saw because I just don't want to waste my time. Now, if there's anyone out there who has played 13 and 13-2 and thinks 13-2 is worth playing, definitely let me know. I'm more than willing to give things a shot if someone suggests to me that it'll be worth it. But after what I played with 13, I just don't feel it's worth it. And that, guys, is how I feel about the rise and fall of Final Fantasy as a franchise. If Square Enix doesn't do something, and I mean soon, and they keep releasing stuff the way the Final Fantasy 13 was released, they may appeal to the lazier gamers who don't really care about the mechanics, but us old Final Fantasy fans that are the diehard ones, the ones who are the true fans of JRPGs, we'll never play it. We won't go back to it. We'll switch to things that are doing it right, like Ni no Kuni, or whatever the game, however you pronounce it. But guys, that's all I wanted to talk about today. I'll see you guys tomorrow for our next daily vlog. Make sure to check us out on Facebook and Twitter. Subscribe to the channel to keep up to date with all our future releases, and hit a like on this video if you like what you're seeing. Leave any comments or suggestions you had about what I've been talking about here, your own opinions on the subject, your own take, down in the comment section below, and let's get a conversation going. I'll see you guys tomorrow. Take care.